Understanding range of motion enables us to treat people as individuals. This is because it provides insight into the unique strengths and weaknesses of someone's anatomy and how they use it. We can use that insight to inform better decisions when it comes to exercise selection, programming, and risk management. By the end of this video, you'll know what range of motion is, have an understanding of how it's tested, and how it can help us to make better decisions. RoM is an acronym that stands for range of motion. More specifically though, it refers to the range of motion of a joint, the point where two or more bones meet. Range of motion can refer to a single joint like the knee, or a collection of joints like the spine. A joint's range of motion is defined as passive or active depending on whether muscle contraction is a factor. Passive range of motion defines the boundaries of where someone's body can move in the absence of muscle contraction. Active range of motion tells us where and how their body functions within those boundaries as a consequence of muscle contraction. Passive range of motion is determined by two factors: the joint's type and anatomical variation. The joint's type, whether that's a hinge joint, saddle joint, etc., defines how it's expected to operate. Anatomical variation is about individual differences in musculoskeletal anatomy. Bone length, bone shape, muscle length, tendon length, and ligament length all affect where a joint can move and will vary from one person to the next. Furthermore, small variations in that anatomy can have outsized effects. For example, the shape of someone's hip socket can mean the difference between squatting above or below parallel, and variations in shoulder anatomy can determine whether someone can get their arms overhead and how wide they'll need to be to get there. If you want to see some real-world examples of how anatomy defines a person's boundaries for movement, check out these two videos by Tom Purvis from PersonalTrainingdotcom. Someone's passive range of motion can also be constrained by acute and chronic factors such as muscle tone, which is contraction at rest, swelling, fractures, tears, adhesions, arthritis, and obesity, among others. And while most of those factors can be improved, passive range of motion is primarily determined by bone length and bone shape, which change very little once reaching adulthood. This means that passive range is unlikely to be altered by stretching or mobilization and must be thought of as a hard boundary that needs to be accepted and accommodated. That said, there are some situations where passive range of motion can be altered, but doing so is beyond the scope of a coach. If that's an avenue you want to pursue, it's best to refer that client to a physiotherapist or orthopedic doctor and get them to assess the situation. A joint's active range of motion is determined by 5 factors: passive range, strength, coordination, proprioception, and the specific movement. Passive-RoM sets the boundaries of where a joint can move, and Active-RoM doesn't change that fact, so it must operate within the boundaries set by the anatomy. Strength is the amount of muscle contraction someone can muster in order to create or prevent movement of a joint. Coordination is what muscles are contracted, their order of contraction, and how effort is shared between them. Proprioception is the interpretation of sensory information about what the body's doing and its position in relation to other objects. And the movement is the specific conditions of the task being performed, whether that's extending the hips from a squat, raising the arms overhead while standing, etc. The interplay between each of those 5 factors will determine where and how a joint moves as a consequence of muscle contraction. Like passive range of motion, active range will vary between people. But unlike passive range, active range can be altered, because the factors of strength, coordination, and proprioception can all be developed through training. Regardless of type, range of motion refers to the operation of joints, the point where 2 or more bones meet. It can refer to a single joint like the knee or a collection of joints like the spine. Passive range of motion focuses on anatomy and how it defines the boundaries of where someone's body can and can't move. Active range of motion is about function, and it covers where and how someone's body operates within the boundaries set by their anatomy. Because range of motion varies from one person to the next, and because understanding those differences can help us make better decisions, we need a way to define an individual's range of motion, and that's achieved through testing. Those tests must be carefully designed and conducted in order to reliably answer specific questions. If a test becomes too complex, The number of variables can become unmanageable and the test unreliable. If a test is poorly conducted, it can provide incomplete or inaccurate information, and that can lead us to make bad decisions about exercise selection, risk management, and programming. There are two ways that range of motion is tested, and this is where the terminology can make things a bit confusing. When testing someone's range, that person is either a passive participant or an active one. A passive participant is relaxed while someone else moves their body for them. An active participant is given clear direction on where and how to move, and they perform the movement themselves. But testing passive range of motion doesn't always require a passive participant. So to avoid getting confused by the same word having multiple meanings, it helps to associate the terms passive and active with what's being assessed. Passive tests refer to the assessment of passive range of motion, and active tests refer to the assessment of active range of motion. For the most part, passive range will be assessed by having the participant relax while the tester moves their body for them. This takes muscle contraction out of the equation, and therefore the factors of strength, coordination, and proprioception that relate to active range of motion. Removing those factors allows the participant's anatomy to be assessed in isolation. But as I mentioned earlier, testing passive range doesn't always require a passive participant, the quadruped rock being one example. The quadruped rock assesses passive range, but the person being examined is responsible for conducting the movement. So while thinking that passive range is assessed with passive participants is true most of the time, it's not true all of the time. Let's look at another example of a passive test, but in more detail. Here I'm assessing whether Joe's shoulder anatomy has enough passive range for the overhead press. I know that the shoulder is a ball and socket joint and therefore how it's supposed to move, but knowing where the shoulder is supposed to move doesn't tell me where Joe's shoulder can move, because it doesn't account for his unique anatomy. To learn where Joe's shoulder can move, I need to assess its passive range of motion. And to do that, I'll need to eliminate the factors which relate to active range. So Joe's going to lie on the floor and relax his muscles while I move his arm for him. When moving his arm, I need to maintain careful control of his elbow and wrist to ensure that his arm remains in the correct position for the overhead press. During the test, I'm watching out for 3 events. The first is Joe tensing up, which would introduce muscle contraction and prevent the assessment of passive range. The second is signs that indicate the end of Joe's passive range, and that means feeling for resistance and watching for change in his torso's position, like lifting the chest. The third is achieving the correct overhead position and noting how wide his arm needs to be to get there. The arm width is important because it translates to grip width on the barbell. Once I've completed that test on both arms, I have an understanding of how Joe's unique shoulder anatomy relates to the demands of the overhead press. I know whether it's capable of getting into the correct position and how wide his arm needs to be to get there. The assessment could also show that Joe's anatomy prohibits his arms from getting overhead without an impractically wide grip. Although disappointing, knowing about that boundary would help me to keep Joe away from an exercise that forces him to compromise his position and therefore his safety and performance. Unlike passive tests, assessing active range of motion always requires an active participant because of what's being assessed, where and how a joint moves as a consequence of muscle contraction. An assessment of active range begins with an explanation and demonstration of the test, as well as a practice run if there's a lot for the participant to remember. Once the test begins, the tester will be observing the participant's performance, palpating specific muscles, or both. Sticking with the shoulder, let's look at an example of an active test. Here I'm assessing whether Joe can get himself into the correct position for the overhead press. Because Joe's responsible for performing the movement, I'd begin by explaining what he needs to do, outlining the rules, and providing a demonstration. For this test, Joe needs to keep his feet flat, his knees, hips, and elbow extended, and maintain a neutral spine. His arm's going to begin by his side with the palm facing the wall, and from there he'll move his arm forward and up in an arc until it's overhead, pointing the elbow laterally throughout the movement. Once at the top of the arc, his palms should be facing forward. Once I'm confident that Joe understands the task, we'll begin the test. During the assessment, I'm watching for 2 different events. The first is Joe breaking any of the rules I outlined at the beginning. This is because those rules focus the test on answering a specific question. Does Joe know how to get his arm overhead without compromising his position or safety? If Joe were to break any of those rules, we'd try again, but repeated mistakes would mean failing the test. The second event is Joe achieving the correct overhead position and how wide his arm needed to be to get there. Once I've completed that test on both arms, I have an understanding of where and how Joe moves into the overhead position, as well as any faults he's likely to commit in the process. I can also compare the findings of this assessment to the passive test I conducted earlier and see whether Joe's ability to move matches his anatomy's capacity for movement. If Joe does commit faults during the test, or his active range doesn't match his passive range, I can conduct further testing to try and uncover potential causes. So let's have a look at one of those tests. Here I'm assessing Joe's coordination. Specifically, I'm assessing a motor pattern that helps to stabilize the shoulder. If that motor pattern is faulty, Joe's likely to become over-reliant on his pectoral and rotator cuff muscles to stabilize the shoulder. That can prevent his arm from getting overhead, as well as compromise his performance and expose him to potential injury. Like all active tests, this one begins with an explanation and demonstration. Joe's task is to perform a standing one-arm push-up against the wall. He needs to keep his palm flat and spine neutral throughout the movement, while his other arm hangs alongside his torso. Lastly, we'll conduct a practice run so that I can make sure Joe's feet aren't too close or too far from the wall, and to ensure that he understands the task. During the test, my job is to observe Joe's movement and palpate or touch the inferior angle of his scapula. During the assessment, I'm watching for one event and feeling for another. Like the last active test, I'm watching for Joe breaking any of the rules I outlined at the beginning, and I'm feeling for where and how his scapula moves during the push-up. As Joe moves towards the wall, I should feel his scapula get closer to his spine and rib cage. As he pushes away from the wall, I should feel his scapula move away from the spine and ribs and back towards its starting position. If everything looks and feels right, then Joe's passed the test. I've eliminated one cause for Joe's limited active range of motion and can begin testing others. However, if Joe fails the test, I've identified a potential cause for his limited active range and can begin to address it in his training program. Over the course of one passive test and two active tests, we've begun to define the range of motion for Joe's shoulder. We've gained insight on how his unique shoulder anatomy might constrain his movement, as well as how it functions in relation to the overhead press. Because those tests were carefully designed and conducted, the information they've provided is likely to be accurate and reliable. Now we need to exploit that information by feeding it into the process of exercise selection, programming, and risk management. When it comes to exercise selection and programming, there are a seemingly infinite number of options to choose from. Some good, some bad, some dangerous. We can whittle down those options by asking questions about what someone's goals are, their training preferences, and how much time they have available, but that still leaves a lot on the table. By testing range of motion before programming, we can create more opportunities to identify bad options and remove them, while highlighting good options worth pursuing. By assessing Joe's passive range of motion, we've determined whether his anatomy is suitable for the overhead press or whether it would expose him to unnecessary risk. We also know how wide his arms need to be, and therefore how wide his grip needs to be when performing the exercise. That knowledge can also be applied beyond the overhead press to the following exercises. What all of these have in common is that they mimic the passive range required of the upper body for the overhead press. By mapping the results of Joe's test onto these exercises, we can identify which ones can be used in his training program. If Joe couldn't achieve a narrow grip, it's safe to assume that the kettlebell overhead press shouldn't be in his training program. Of course, the results could show that Joe's anatomy is entirely unsuitable for the overhead press, and although disappointing, that knowledge is still useful. First, it tells us that performing the overhead press would force Joe to compromise his position and therefore his safety and performance. Second, it allows us to select alternative shoulder exercises that Joe can perform safely, like the incline press or lateral raises, and include them in his training program. By assessing active range of motion, we've seen how Joe gets into the overhead position and identified faults that would compromise his safety or performance. We've also compared Joe's active range to his passive range to see whether his ability to move matches his anatomy's capacity for movement. If Joe achieved the overhead position without error, We don't have to worry about reconditioning exercises for that movement and can include it in his training program. If Joe's program included a lot of reconditioning exercises for other movements, the overhead press might be somewhere for him to have a bit of fun and more of a challenge to stop training from getting stale and boring. If Joe committed faults but was able to fix them, we can still program the overhead press, but we've also identified what he needs to remember to perform the movement safely. We might also program some exercises that further ingrain those habits to prepare him for heavier and more complex variations of the overhead press in the future. The worst case is Joe committing faults he wasn't able to fix, or having sufficient passive range for the movement but insufficient active range. In either case, we would select alternative shoulder exercises that Joe can perform while programming reconditioning exercises that address the mistakes he's making. This allows us to minimize risk and address Joe's faults without leaving a hole in his training program. By testing Joe's passive and active range and assessing the results, we've created opportunities to identify bad options and remove them while highlighting good options worth pursuing. The assessment of passive range helped us to identify whether Joe's anatomy is suitable for the overhead press and how wide his grip needs to be, as well as his suitability for a range of similar movements. The assessment of active range helped us determine Joe's ability to move into the overhead position and identify any faults he committed. We know whether it's safe to program the overhead press and what faults need to be addressed through his training program. By comparing Joe's active range to his passive range, we've also identified whether there's a gap between his capacity to move and his ability to move. If there is a gap, we know that his body can get into the overhead position, but he doesn't know how to get there. Through further testing, we've identified potential causes for that gap and can begin addressing them immediately in his training program. In this video, we've covered the two types of range of motion, how they're tested, and how understanding them can help us make better decisions. But in truth, we've barely scratched the surface of this invaluable tool. We've focused on the overhead press, but range of motion applies to any exercise that requires a joint or collection of joints to move or maintain a specific position. Extending the testing process to encompass more of the body would allow us to develop a more detailed picture of a client's anatomy and how it operates. Achieving all of that is no easy task, and we'll need to develop our knowledge of anatomy, function, testing, and exercises to do it. But in doing so, we can make better decisions about programming that minimize risk without neglecting the quality of someone's training.